Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Sword Art Online Alicization episode review. This one's going to be for episode 2, which is called The Demon Tree. I suppose technically the third episode in terms of the amount of content that we've seen, but first episode was obviously 2 episodes together. And I thought this was a really interesting episode because I suppose as someone who has read a lot of the light novels, not all of them, but most of the early ones for this arc, I'm definitely viewing this from a perspective of like, what's the pacing like for this? How quickly are they getting through this content? And to me, this episode really highlighted that they're going to take their time to explain stuff when they need to. They are not going to rush past and rush through a lot of the content like in a way some of the earlier arcs do. Now, admittedly, in those earlier arcs, it kind of feels that way because it's the arcs are based off effectively only like 1 or 2 light novels worth of content, whereas here we have this arc that is like basically like 10 volumes or something like that. So we've got a lot of books to kind of get through here. A lot of explanation because it's the most in-depth arc, and this episode really highlighted that in that you could say from a certain perspective that not a lot really happened in this episode, especially given the cliffhanger from last week's episode with Kirito quote-unquote dead. Now, I think for the most part anyone can figure out like roughly what's happening, but they haven't cut to, I suppose, Kirito being in the STL again, so we don't know the full kind of significance of what's going on here, in that you could be like, wait, have they put like Kirito's like soul into this thing and his body is like gone, or is he just hooked up to this? Like, they haven't answered that yet. What we do know is that Kirito's consciousness, at the very least, is alive, and it's inside the underworld again. But notably, and this is where the really interesting thing comes in, is that we obviously saw this. This is how they started the first episode. Kirito's obviously older in this case, and they explain it that like 6 years have passed. But in this case, it's this unique situation where we know from Kirito's perspective why he doesn't remember, because they explain that as a tester, he always had his memory erased every time he came in and out of the machine. That doesn't necessarily explain why Yu-Gi-Oh here doesn't actually remember Kirito. Maybe like you almost expected that like he would remember that basically 2 people went missing 6 years ago, but he only remembers that Alice went missing, even though we know Kirito was a part of this situation. So that's a big mystery here that they basically explain towards the end. Not properly explain, but Kirito mentions it, that like they're artificial fluctlights, and we know the fluctlight is basically this show's version of the soul. So they're basically saying an artificially made soul, which they were basically saying is the light that travels through the different connections in your brain. So part of this technology is that they've somehow managed to figure out how to make a artificial soul, which is basically they've more or less made an artificial person, which is obviously this kind of very unique and different and completely high-end version of an AI. And that's what this whole episode, I think, was trying to get across from Kirito's perspective. Why it was kind of fairly slowly paced, just Kirito and Yu-Gi-Oh, mainly to just get across that it takes Kirito a while to realize that 100% for sure he is in a game. They've already sort of explained the whole graphics thing, that because it's based on memories and not built in the way an usual game is, that's why everything looks so realistic. The thing here that he's kind of struggling with is that it can't be that these are all just other testers, because no one can act that well. This many people acting together, someone would break out and say something that would make it clear that they're gamers. That's why, like, obviously in like the first arcs of the show, they were all talking about like logging out, game mechanics. They didn't just default to talking as if they were in this sort of fantasy world. Similarly here, Kirito immediately starts talking about logging out, whereas Yu-Gi-Oh has no idea what that means. So it's completely real to Yu-Gi-Oh. He talks as if he's lived here for 6 years, that this is whole 300-year history. And then I think very notably, the way they basically have an in-universe, in the underworld explanation for basically people who play the game. People who come in have no backstory within the world, and their explanation, the children of Velda, is it? I keep forgetting this thing, but that they have this sort of lore built into the world, that this sort of God is kind of this who steals like humans, takes their memories away, and they kind of just appear and disappear. I thought that's really interesting, that because this would happen, because we know it is this sort of test environment, there are multiple testers and so on, that this would be something that beings who live in this world full time would be aware of, that sometimes people are there for a while and then disappear. They know that people are losing their memories of certain things and so on, so that they actually have this explanation, and it's sort of built into the world, that it's one of these things that people tend to just accept. If they give them this story of like, this person doesn't remember anything, they're one of the lost kind of children, most people just accept it and they kind of move on. Similarly, they once again brought up the idea of like the taboo index, with Yu-Gi-Oh recounting how Alice went missing and the fact that Kirito doesn't remember it, and just with some of the stuff that they're saying here, making it very clear that basically the people of this world can't break these taboo indexes. And I think the thing that got that across the most was Kirito asking, why don't you lock the door? Do you not think what if someone steals the axe or something like that? And Yu-Gi-Oh's just like, no, I don't need to lock the door, because it's a law in the taboo index that you can't steal. And so it's this idea that because it's a law, it can't be broken. It's not just a case of like that most people abide by the laws, but some people will break them. It's this thing where like, no, in general those laws don't get broken, which again asks you to think about the first episode, and how Alice was even in the first place able to touch the dark territory, why she was able to break the rule. We know it was by accident, but they basically more or less imply in this episode that if something is written in the taboo index, you can't really break it by accident. And so this is where obviously they're getting to this idea of artificial floodlights, and they're very realistic in some ways, but sort of not realistic in others. And it seems like free will is going to be one of those things. Just the fact that like Kirito brings up all of these ideas of like, why don't you just go look for her? And when Kirito kind of says why he can't, he's like, but if you just did this, this, and this, you could go. And Yu-Gi-Oh's just like, no, actually I can't. I have to do my calling, which is, and this was the big explanation here about the Gigas Cedar and why he has this axe and all the significance of that he is tasked, his job, and he's the 7th generation, I think they say, or something like that. All he has to do all day, his job, is to just hack away at this giant tree to try and cut it down, because this tree is basically absorbing so much of the nutrients from the ground that they can't actually expand out their fields in terms of making more food for themselves and so on. So this tree kind of is this, from a gameplay perspective, it's this kind of roadblock to sort of like progress and expansion for this kind of group of humans, in that they can only make a certain amount of food, which means that their population can only be so big. And it's obviously in a way like this gameplay kind of conceit, in a way of like, this thing allows like the people viewing this game to just monitor a certain town, and they don't have to monitor this town which grows into like 5 towns. It'll only ever grow to a certain point, and that will be immediately stopped by the fact that this tree stops there from being this much more food. So that's very interesting, in that like it does put a sort of time limit on the game, in that eventually that tree will be cut down, but that's in like 20-30 generations time, such as how slow the progress is on this. And I like that Kirito is immediately like, oh, I'll do this, I have some skills. And they sort of get across the idea that this is, this is going to be this sort of hybrid game that's kind of part Aincrad, part Fairy Dance, part GGO, kind of incorporating all of those aspects of like, it's much more physical because of how realistic everything is modeled. There are still sword skills in the game, but there is some element of it applies your actual real life physicality to it as well. But so it's kind of a blend of all of the different kind of styles of real world plus gameplay here. And I thought it was a cool scene to see Kirito use the sword skill when they get into the village and they meet the guy who has the actual man at arms calling and so on. So, you know, the episode ended in a sort of an odd place of just Kirito's given a place to sleep and just reflects on the fact that, you know, everything I've seen today, there's no way these people are testers like me. There's no way they're NPCs, which means they have to be artificial Floodlights. That's the way this game operates, based on Floodlights, and that's how you could basically make real people participating in the game without actually having just real people. So that's going to have to be obviously explained. We're going to have to, I suppose, get into I suppose the progress here. I'm wondering when exactly the anime is going to approach revealing what happened in real life. With all of this, what actually happened to Kirito in real life? What's Asuna doing? Has everyone found out about what's happened to Kirito? And so on. With regards to him being in the game, he talks early on as if, like, previously he was able to just talk in the game, and that would get out to the outside world, and they could just let him out. He talks about Kikuoka and someone called Higa. So they're obviously the two people he knows about who are involved in all of this. So that's not necessarily working, and I think part of that is because of whatever situation has led to him being put back into the game. He can't log out for now is obviously the takeaway that we're meant to have, given what happened previously. Beyond that, all I'll say is that, again, I like that they spent the time to focus on the kind of, I suppose, early development of this kind of relationship between these two characters, in that it seems pretty clear that Kirito has a like vague recollection of, like, he feels something with all of this stuff being mentioned. The name Alice kind of means something. The name Yu-Gi-Oh means something. Even the axe, I suppose, like, reminded him of something. And I think Yu-Gi-Oh is kind of has a slight sense of that as well. We'll see how much they get into it now. We're also introduced to Selka at the end, but I don't think they've revealed too much about her just yet, but I suppose we'll get into that. Yu-Gi-Oh had a kind of weird look when he kind of saw her, so they'll address that as we go forward. Beyond that, I suppose they're just setting up that Kirito for now is probably just going to settle into this in terms of in the game. He's going to be helping Yu-Gi-Oh perform his duty as the kind of carver here of this tree. And then we'll get to, I suppose, figuring out, working out a plan to rescue Alice and actually move things along. That's basically what I think most people are aware of as the main plot of Alicization. So, yeah. Like the episode, I think the first episode, obviously, being the intro, was a little bit more action-packed and dramatic. But I like the kind of slow nature of, like, them gradually getting the explanation across. There's a lot of details that are kind of coming out here, and that's why I've been able to talk for so long about an episode where not too much happened, and that it really was just like Kirito wakes up in a forest, meets Yu-Gi-Oh, they talk, they hit the tree a few times, they kind of have, like, they eat together, and then they go back to the town, and there's, like, a little bit of a montage. Like, not a lot happens in the episode, but all of the details, because we know so little about what's going on, I think made the episode. So I'm really enjoying this arc. I liked it in the light novels, and I'm really liking the anime adaptation. So they're my thoughts on this week's episode. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on episode 2 of Alicization. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.